middle school, even from Roosevelt Elementary. He was a problem child, and even got booted out of the boarding school his parents sent him to, where they hoped he'd learn to straighten himself out. But he returned here, graduated from Mason City High School, then from Drake University in 1983. And along the way, he made some influential friends, including the man who became the 40th President of the United States, Ronald Reagan. He told me a really great story about that. I don't know if he's going to share that. But when he was 11 years old, he was talking to Ronald's brother in Clear Lake and said, "Hey, you know, your name's the same name as that governor guy." And the rest is kind of history. He'll fill you in on how that took off. As he'll tell you, he developed a drug addiction, which landed him in rehab, got him locked up a few times. So please join me in welcoming our guest, Todd Blodgett.
Thank you. I grew up here, as many of you know, and my dad actually was in Rotary back when your meetings were held at the old Hotel Hanford back in the day. I noticed that in recent years your speakers have included Governor Branstad and the presidents of NIAC and Mercy Health Center. And you've also had the executive director of the University of Iowa's Art Museum speak here. You've hosted distinguished professionals from the fields of commerce, education, healthcare, the military, and the legal profession. Today you've got a recovering crackhead who is locked up in 4 jails in 3 states. I'm not sure I fit in with your list of rather esteemed speakers. For me to have the honor of addressing you is sort of like Donald Trump becoming ambassador to Mexico. I never thought I'd ever become a drug addict. Growing up, I played Little League Baseball, had a Globe Gazette paper out, I was a Boy Scout, and attended First Presbyterian Church. I ran track at John Adams and at the high school. In the summers, I raced a sailboat on Clear Lake. I worked for the Barlesses and was a janitor at Cresney's. My upbringing was nothing short of ideal. But in 1999, crack cocaine entered my life. By 2001, it was adversely affecting my business, my marriage, relations with my family members, friends, employees, and clients. I met Ronald Reagan 5 years before I became president. We stayed in touch, and he hosted me for a couple of one-on-one Oval Office visits when I was during my college years at Drake. He personally hired me in January of 1985 to serve on his White House staff. And for me, working for my political hero at the age of 24 was just a dream job. There I met Lee Atwater, who also later got me jobs with the first President Bush and at the Republican National Committee. During the Clinton years, I published a magazine and owned an advertising agency. As a drug addict, several times a week, I would venture into the most dangerous neighborhoods, the most dangerous parts of our nation's capital in search of a fix. I was a regular at drug dens and crack houses located in neighborhoods feared by the cops and which made the worst parts of Mason City look like Beverly Hills. My addiction cost me my 10-year marriage and over $800,000. I was arrested and jailed. I landed in 4 rehab facilities and was hospitalized 3 times from injuries received in fights with drug dealers. I learned the hard way that fighting with drug pushers on their turf made about as much sense as fighting over an old hubcap at the landfill with Max Weber. In my view, I hate to say this, but in my view, a Republican victory next year is unlikely. I think that Hillary knows that 2016 is her last chance to find out what it's like to sleep in the president's bed. Ronald Reagan was unlike anyone I've ever known. He was the same person in person as he was on television. In the Oval Office in 1986, Reagan asked me how I liked working there and working for him. He said to me, "How do you like it here?" And I said, "Mr. President, I'm just a guy from a little town in the Midwest. And here I am working in the White House, sitting with you, the President of the United States, in the Oval Office." And Reagan took a sip of his iced tea and he said, "Todd, I'm just a fellow from the Midwest, in a little town in the Midwest." He said, "I work in the White House. I'm sitting in the Oval Office, and I am the president. How do you think I feel?" He was truly humble, and he liked being underestimated. Ronald Reagan deliberately effectuated an image of himself, which fooled his opponents. After demolishing them at the polls, he basically didn't care who got the credit as long as his objectives were achieved. He was also a very ambitious man, probably the most ambitious man I've ever met, and highly intelligent. It's interesting how his opponents, including Jimmy Carter and Walter Mondale, still think they're smarter than he was. Ronald and Nancy Reagan promoted the most comprehensive anti-drug effort of any administration. It was called Just Say No. That was the title of their program. I wish I had, because regardless of politics, socioeconomic status, family background, or education, anyone can become a drug addict. My addiction began a year before I went to work for the FBI. The Bureau hired me in March of 2000 to monitor the Ku Klux Klan, the Aryan Nations, and violent racist skinheads and money laundering neo-Nazis. The FBI had already granted me a top security clearance for my White House job. They knew I wasn't a racist or dangerous, but my ad agency had represented some magazines published by what's known as the extreme far right. Commissions were owed to me, and in lieu of payment, I was issued stock in the world's largest, most profitable hate music corporation, of which I wanted no part. A month later, after those shares were registered, a man named Dr. William Pierce called my office and asked to buy my shares. Pierce was a renowned physicist and a best-selling author. He was also America's leading neo-Nazi. Effectively, he was in the hate business. He brought to my office in D.C. a briefcase filled with 2,500 $100 bills, $250,000 in cash. I took one look and said, sold. 2 weeks later, 3 FBI agents visited me at the office. Pierce was on their radar, as were others that they knew I knew. I was paid $6,500 a month to do the surveillance work, plus all expenses. I was wired with a recording device configured to look like a pager. By the way, Ronald Reagan in the 1940s was also an FBI informant, although he wasn't full-time or paid as I was. Reagan's code name was T10. Mine was Rommel. From day one, I was appalled at what I saw. Kids, young kids, being indoctrinated into hatred. One example I'll share with you truly stood out. After suffering through a pseudo-sermon preached by a so-called minister who spoke from a lectern that had a swastika painted on the front, a little girl who was walking out the door, she was in front of me, she turned to her mother and she said, "Mommy, why does God let Jews live?" That's what she said to her mother. At the age of 5 or maybe 6, this little girl was already brainwashed. Monitoring money laundering and other activities took me to 22 states and to the United Kingdom, Germany, Canada, Grand Cayman, Liechtenstein, Bermuda, Switzerland, and Austria. The Bureau sent me to every major gathering of racists in the United States and most of those in Europe, many abroad. What I saw was absolutely reprehensible, almost indescribable. The KKK conventions were wicked, but others were actually far worse. Well, a lot of the fellows over at these meetings made about 200 to 250 crude, profane, hateful hillbillies. They were shouting the N-word and Heil Hitler. They wore baseball caps with swastika patches and wife-beater t-shirts that promoted the Third Reich. They chain-smoked unfiltered Camels, belched, and gulped beer straight from the pitcher. These drunken bigots reeked of tobacco juice, which in some cases infested their beards. Nazi tattoos covered their forearms. They tied their hair into greasy ponytails and fought violently over bets at the pool table and the dartboard. And that was just the women. Men were worse. Several racists I surveilled made international news. One shot up the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., killing a black guard. Another shot 12 people at a Hindu temple in Milwaukee and killed 6. Yet another now serves life for killing 2 black men in Kansas City. David Duke, the former head of the KKK, was among those I monitored. After 3 years, the FBI and I called it quits. The main target of the investigation they hired me for, William Pierce, suddenly died. But by then, crack cocaine had become my chief interest, and my then wife wanted a trial separation. When my dad completed his 4th term representing Sarasota County in the state legislature in 2001, President Bush appointed him as a federal administrative judge in D.C. with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. My parents moved to D.C., where they lived for 7 years. My dad worked 60-plus hours a week, and my mother volunteered on the White House staff of Laura Bush. Also at this time, my mom was very involved in charity work and served as a corporate director. Her duties included a seat on the board of directors of the Michigan-based corporation of which Mason City's Mercy Medical is a subsidiary. So the last thing my busy folks needed was a junkie son. I was divorced in 2005, and later that year, President and Mrs. Bush hosted my parents and a few others at the White House for a small dinner party. I drove my parents there and had agreed to pick them up later and take them back to their apartment. But instead, I drove into the hoods. My dad and a black man who worked in the condo where they lived, a very long-time family friend, drove together into basically the ghettos of DC looking for me. Finally, my dad had to hire a licensed private investigator to learn what was going on, and that's what he did. My life as a crackhead in DC and Baltimore led to violence. I was mugged twice and got in fights with drug dealers who cheated me. I was taken by ambulance to hospitals. My spleen was removed after a knife fight in which I got the point. Spent 12 days in intensive care, 6 more in a recovery unit. Upon release, I wanted cocaine. I began carrying a handgun loaded with hollow point rounds which explode on impact. Usually I carried a 380 Walther PPK, sometimes a stainless steel Ruger. It's illegal to carry a gun in DC, and had I been caught, I'd have gone straight to federal prison. I never shot anyone and I didn't need to. People in the hoods don't expect a white guy driving a Range Rover to be armed. Some of the thugs I dealt with were shocked when I pulled the gun. 3 punks one time tried to rob me in a dark alley in northwest DC at about 3 o'clock in the morning. They see me buy crack. As I walked in the alley toward the street where my car was parked, one of them said, they confronted me, and one said, "Hand us over your drugs, your watch, your money, your car keys, and you might not have to go to the ER, meaning emergency room." Now, I knew, after all those years being in the hoods, I knew that if these punks had a weapon, they would have showed it to me, and they didn't. And I didn't say anything other than buzz off. The ringleader said, "Don't make us teach you how things work in the hood." Those punks had no idea that as I reached in my pocket, they'd be facing a loaded gun. But that's what happened. I wasn't going to shoot them, but they didn't know that. I made them face the alley wall and told them to place their hands on their head. One of them hesitated. I said, "Hands on your head if you want to keep them." You see, as a kid, I used to watch Gunsmoke, and I heard Marshall Dillon say that one time to an outlaw. It took me 30 years to be able to work that line into conversation. As I walked backwards to my vehicle, I kept my gun on the thugs, who still faced the wall, hands on heads. I drove off and yelled, "Be careful, guys, I've heard this place is dangerous." Another time in a crack house, 4 junkies teamed up with a female crackhead, knocked me to the floor, and took my billfold. They should have gone for what was in my front pocket. One junkie joined me in demanding they return my wallet. The fight was on. As they closed in, one guy said, "You're going to need all the help you can get." I pulled a .32, aimed it their way, and said, "Say hi to the help." I got my money back and no one got hurt. Another time I was at the home of a drug dealer whose nickname was T. That's all we ever knew was T. And he had a friend there named Boo who dealt in stolen merchandise. This is not uncommon in the hoods. It's not a racial thing at all. Believe me, if anything, the white people in the hoods are far more corrupt than the black ones. I saw it myself. But T had given cash to Boo for a mink coat for his mother. Boo had yet to deliver it, and T asked if the coat was hot. Hot, of course, is ghetto slang for stolen. Boo said, "Well, it might be a little warm." And then he said he wanted to know why all of a sudden T even cared if the coat was stolen. T said, "It ain't me, dude, it's my mama." Boo said, "Well, what's your mama say?" T said, "My mama told me she don't want no mink stole." So I just kind of stayed out of that one. That's how it happened. That's exactly what happened in that. I also heard and witnessed things that showed the human tragedy of racial prejudice and its horrific impact on society. The 8-year-old son of a black lady I knew told me he wished he was white. He said, I asked him why. And his response was interesting. He said, "Mr. Todd, would you rather be black and live to be 100 or stay white and live to be 60? Life as an addict also taught me that some folks at the bottom of our society are actually more honorable than many at the top. I saw that firsthand. In 2005, I got an apartment in DC about 4 miles from my parents' condo. My drug use escalated. For the prior 2 years, I squandered around $3,500 a week on crack cocaine. This pace continued and then rose to about $4,000 a week for all of 2004 and 2005, and lasted until I was busted in 2006. Between 2004 and 2005, I was in 3 drug rehab facilities but didn't want to quit. I delivered powder cocaine for a Baltimore-based supplier to dealers in D.C., Philadelphia, and New York City. Being a white guy with an expensive car and nice clothes and no outstanding arrest warrants made me ideal for that job. As I drove through Philadelphia one night, it dawned on me, in my first 18 years in D.C., I had worked for 2 presidents, 2 U.S. senators, the FBI, the Speaker of the U.S. House, and the chairman of a national political party. Now, my employer sold cocaine to drug dealers. I had degenerated to the point where I personified what my headmaster at Shattuck School called downward mobility. In February 2006, I was busted for possession of narcotics. I was held in a private cell in D.C.'s central lockup, still wearing the suit I wore when arrested. My necktie, my belt, and my shoelaces were all confiscated. But even that humiliation did not lessen my desire for drugs. I was placed on what they call pretrial status and had to submit the drug test 3 times a week. I kept right on smoking crack, knowing I would inevitably fail a drug test. It was back to jail. This time, though, the judge sent me to be incarcerated in the main D.C. Correctional Center, which is more like a prison than a jail. I wore an orange jumpsuit, just like you see on TV, for 3 nights and 4 days. I spent the first night in a large holding cell with about 80 others, some of whom were on their way to prison. One guy I was locked up with was a black man I knew from the hoods, and we were friends. He saw me there, and this is a guy who knew about my life before drugs. When he looked at me, he said, "Damn, y'all went from the White House to the crack house." And then he said, "And now you're in the big house." I said, "Yeah." Well, in line for breakfast, a guy looked at me and said, "I want to thank you for those eggs and bacon." I said, "What eggs and bacon?" He said, "The eggs and bacon you're going to give me." And he got them. The fellow behind him was huge. He assured me I'd get to drink my orange juice. So I reached out my hand and looked up at him and smiled and said, "Thanks, I'm Todd, who are you?" He said, "I'm the dude that's taking your biscuit and your jelly." I can assure you, based on my experience, the D.C. jail is more effective than Weight Watchers or Slim Fast. Upon release, I pled guilty to 1 count of possession, got probation for 12 months. I met with the probation officer every week. I was drug tested 3 times a week, then down to 2, then once weekly. After that, every other week I was subjected to drug testing, including random testing. Tested clean every time. I took recovery seriously. I attended 2, sometimes 3 Narcotics Anonymous meetings a day. I took long walks, joined a health club, worked out, and attended a specialized outpatient treatment clinic. A year later, I didn't want any illegal drugs. I returned to Iowa in 2008, and on May 6th of this year, celebrated 9 years of being free of any illegal drugs. My parents returned here when President Bush left office. I took a job in Texas, which I still have, and I still attend NA meetings, Narcotics Anonymous meetings. If not for my parents and the skilled professionals who helped me to get clean, and that includes some at Prairie Ridge, I'd either be dead or in prison or out still using. If you or anyone you know has a drug problem, get help or help them to get help. But to quit, you must want to succeed. Of course, with drugs, it's best to just never start. Many times I wish I'd listened better to Ronald Reagan when he said about drugs, just say no. It's been a pleasure being here. Thank you very much. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to entertain them at this time. If anyone has any questions about what I said, no problem if you don't. Oh, yes, sir.
Do you go to these meetings and do you speak to the people that are trying to get clean?
You're asking if I still attend Narcotics Anonymous meetings?
Right.
Yeah, I do, not as regularly as I did at first. I attend meetings here in Mason City. They have an excellent group here. There's also a meeting in Clear Lake. When I'm down in Texas, I try to attend meetings also. Sometimes it's once a week, sometimes it's twice, sometimes it might be every other week, but I'm still very much involved in my group. Absolutely. Yes?
How common is drug usage, serious drug usage, in the inner circles in Washington?
You're asking about serious drug usage in the school system?
No, in Washington, D.C., in the
Washington,
political
D.C.
circles.
I would say that the drug usage in DC political circles is as bad or worse as it is in the so-called ghettos. I don't mean to say that everyone there is shooting up heroin, but there's plenty of people I knew and know in DC that use drugs on a regular basis, and they might have a fancy title. They might, be a rich lobbyist or an aide to a senator, or married to some congressman or something like that. The reason you don't hear about that as often, though, is they have access to the lawyers and they have the money to get the best legal counsel, and you don't hear about that as often because their lawyers will get them basically pled out, whereas the people that I smoked with would usually get a public defender that's overworked, underpaid, and they basically end up, taking it the hard way. But it's quite rampant to this day. Yes?
Just dovetailing off Mr. Mathis's question, so given the fact that you had what we'll call an inside perspective on this, and it's pretty clear your folks were very instrumental in helping you get through this to where you are today, what's your perspective on how those less fortunate that have the addictions could possibly get to a better place and get some help?
It's a great question. Kind of follows up on what was said earlier, and that is, there's a big problem in society today. If you don't have supportive parents and you're a drug addict, and if your parents are supportive but yet don't have much money, you're not going to be able to get the kind of help that is needed. I will never be a liberal Democrat, but I'll tell you one thing: I do admire what the current administration is trying to do to help addicts, because they have done a better job of that than what's happened before. It's not a level playing field. You get people out there that, I know people in my group that have worked far harder on their recovery than I ever did, and yet they have relapses. And I don't know if it's an inborn thing or parents were addicts or whatever. Mine were not, but something clearly must be done about that, and I hope that people are more understanding about the need to do that. I think we should have mandatory testing, but we can't just have a situation where if someone who's on welfare fails a drug test, we're not going to throw them out in the snow. We need to make sure that their families continue to receive the help they need, because it's not their fault that the head of the household is an addict, and that the addict who tested positive for meth or cocaine or whatever gets the help that he or she needs to get clean and stay clean. Yes?
What was your initial entry point or introduction point? Was it because of serving all those undercover operations, or was your entry point because you mentioned the circles, the mainstream circles? Where did you initially turn to drugs?
The question was, where did I first start getting into hard drugs in D.C.? And the answer is, there was a lobbyist, and his name was Greg Stevens, and he was a Republican lobbyist, by the way, from San Clemente, California, or Nixon's hometown, and he was the one that first introduced me to crack cocaine. He since has died. He was actually found dead at the home of the actress Carrie Fisher about 10 years ago on the night before the Academy Awards. He was one of these guys that was really well connected, and he died of an overdose, a heroin and cocaine overdose.
Had nothing to do with drugs?
No, my drug usage was simultaneous with my undercover work. But you see, as an informant, I was not subjected to mandatory testing the way agents would be. So, and I always made sure if I had to meet with some honchos from the FBI, I stayed away from the crack pipe for a day or two. But yeah, it had nothing to do with my becoming an addict. I was an addict before the FBI hired me to work for them, and after I was done. Yes?
Todd, is your craving for drugs as a former addict constant, or is it sporadic?
Well, when I first got clean, and this is after being in jail, being in rehabs and all that, my craving was, I won't say it was constant, but let's say it like this. I only wanted drugs when I was breathing. So when I would breathe, I wanted them. It was pretty bad. And after I began recovery, I did have a relapse, and I got out of that. What's that? And basically, yeah, I said breathing, by the way. That's breathe, yeah. Anyway, the thing is, what happened was, after about a year of serious work on my problem, which included attending sometimes 2 or 3 meetings a day, meeting with a specialized treatment therapist and all that, and just basically avoiding all the people and places and things that led to my usage and prolonged it, I lost the craving about a year later, but that was a crucial time. Since then, I have want nothing to do with any of it. Thank you. Anything else? Anyone else? I guess that covers it. Thank you very much. It's been nice meeting you. On behalf of the Mason City Noon Rotary Club, there's Ben. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. All right. Any other